The coffee on her kitchen counter was still warm when they realized she was gone. On the morning of October 4th, 1979, in the town of Harrow Falls, Michigan, population 2,200, a woman named Diane Lorene Merchant had made coffee, poured it into a blue ceramic mug with a chip in the handle, and set it on the counter the way she did every single morning. Her coat was on its hook by the door. Her keys were on the table. Her car was in the driveway. What happened in the next 3 hours would haunt Harrow Falls for the next 44 years, and the answer, when it finally came, would be found 3 miles from that kitchen counter, on a piece of land that everyone in town knew by name. Harrow Falls sat in the thumb of Michigan, the kind of place that people from the cities drove through without stopping unless they needed gas. The town had grown up around a grain elevator and a lumber mill in the early part of the century, and by 1979 it had settled into the permanent, comfortable stillness of a community that had already become exactly what it was going to be. There were 2 churches on Main Street, the Lutheran and the Methodist, and the question of which one you attended told people something about your family they felt they already knew. There was a grain and feed store, a 5 and dime that was holding on by its fingernails against the Kmart that had opened in the county seat, a diner called Loretta's, where the coffee came in heavy white mugs and the booths were the original vinyl from 1958. In the fall of 1979, with the harvests coming in and the smell of turned earth hanging over the county roads, Harrow Falls felt like the kind of place where nothing bad had ever happened. Diane Lorene Merchant was 34 years old. She had lived her whole life within 20 miles of the town, born in the county hospital, raised on her father's soy and corn operation east of Harrow Falls, and returned to it after 2 years at Central Michigan University, where she had studied bookkeeping and met a man who had, eventually, moved on without her. She had been a bookkeeper at the Harrow Falls Farm Bureau for 11 years. She handled the accounts for 32 member farms in the county, knew every landowner by first name, and was, according to her supervisor Warren Eckley, the only person in the building who understood the filing system she had built from scratch in 1971. She was not someone you could easily replace, Warren would say later, and he had meant it as a professional observation. But by the time he said it, it meant something else entirely. She had a sister named Connie, who lived 12 miles away in the next town over. She had a niece and 2 nephews she saw every Sunday at her parents' farm for dinner. She had a beagle named Grover she had gotten from a litter on the Hennessy farm 2 years earlier, and Grover slept at the foot of her bed and waited by the back door every morning until she let him into the yard. She kept a vegetable garden on the south side of her rented house on Aldrich Road and canned her tomatoes every August with a thoroughness that her neighbors found both impressive and slightly daunting. She was, by all accounts that exist, a woman who had built a life that was modest and exact and entirely her own, and she tended it with the same careful attention she brought to the Farm Bureau's accounts. On the morning she disappeared, Diane was supposed to open the Farm Bureau at 8 o'clock. She did this every Thursday and Friday. At 8:17, the phone at the bureau rang, and no one answered it. At 8:45, Warren Eckley arrived, found the office dark, and assumed Diane was sick. He tried her home phone. No answer. He let it go until noon. At noon, he tried again. No answer. At 2:30 that afternoon, Warren drove out to Aldrich Road. The front door was unlocked. Grover was inside, frantic, pacing. He had not been let out. The coffee mug was on the counter, half empty and cold. Diane's coat was on its hook. Her keys were on the table. Her purse, with her wallet inside, was on the chair in the bedroom. Warren called the Van Buren County Sheriff's Office. At 2:47 p.m. deputies arrived within the hour. They searched the house and the yard. They walked the tree line behind the property. They found nothing. Grover would not stop moving. He kept going to the back door, pressing against it, then turning back to look at whoever was in the room. By the following morning, October 5th, a search had been organized. Neighbors, farm families from the county, members of both the Lutheran and the Methodist churches fanned out across the fields and roads around Aldrich Road. The Van Buren County Sheriff's Office assigned a detective named Leonard Marsh to lead the investigation. Marsh was 41 years old, a former state police officer who had come to the county department 6 years earlier, and who had the reputation, among his colleagues, of being the kind of detective who did not close a case until it was closed. By October 7th, 3 days after Diane was last known to be home, a search party working a grid pattern along Sutter Creek Road, 3 miles northeast of Aldrich Road, found her. She was in a field at the edge of an irrigation ditch on property belonging to a farm called the Hessler Operation. The land had been fallow that year. No one had reason to be on it. The Van Buren County Medical Examiner determined cause of death as asphyxiation. The manner of death was homicide. She had been there since the morning of October 4th. Leonard Marsh ran the investigation with everything the department had. He interviewed everyone in Diane's life, her co-workers at the Farm Bureau, the 32 farm families she served, her neighbors on Aldrich Road, her sister Connie, her parents. He established that Diane had last been seen the previous evening, October 3rd, at Loretta's Diner, where she had eaten supper alone and left around 7:30. The counter-waitress, a woman named Beverly Stahl, confirmed she had seemed completely normal, paid her bill, left a 50-cent tip, walked out into the parking lot. No one saw her after that. Marsh examined the Hessler property carefully. The land was owned by a family that had farmed the county for 3 generations. Harold Hessler, 67 years old, and his son Dale, who was 38. Both were interviewed. Both had alibis for the morning of October 4th that were confirmed. Harold had been at the grain elevator at 6 in the morning, documented by 3 other farmers who saw him there. Dale had been in Kalamazoo for a parts order, confirmed by the supplier's receipt log. A broader net was cast. Marsh looked at every man in Diane's life, recent and historical. The ex-boyfriend from Central Michigan, located in Grand Rapids, married, with an alibi. A former Farm Bureau client who had disputed an account with Diane the previous spring, interviewed, eliminated. A man who had reportedly followed Diane to her car after the county fair in August, identified as a neighbor's visiting brother-in-law, ruled out within a week. The physical evidence from the Hessler field was limited. A partial boot print in the soft ground near the ditch. Fiber samples taken from Diane's clothing. A tire track impression from what appeared to be a pickup truck on the 2-track that ran along the field's north edge. The boot print was size 11. The tire track matched a common all-season tread used on roughly a third of all trucks in the county that year. Neither was enough to name anyone. By Christmas of 1979, the active investigation had not stopped, but it had slowed to the methodical crawl of a case without a direction to run. Marsh had a file that kept growing and a list of leads that kept going cold. The Van Buren County Sheriff's Office had a homicide with no arrest. Connie Merchant drove out to the Hessler field once, in November before the first snow came. She stood at the edge of the irrigation ditch for a long time, and then drove home and did not go back. She had 2 small children of her own, and she could not afford, she told herself, to stand in that field any longer than she had to. By 1985, 6 years had passed. The Harrow Falls 5 and Dime had finally closed. A new family had moved into Diane's house on Aldrich Road. Leonard Marsh had moved the Merchant file to a dedicated drawer in his office which he reviewed, without fail, on the first Monday of every month. This was not a department policy. It was a private one, something Marsh had decided for himself and never announced, and never stopped doing. By 1990, 11 years had passed. Marsh's reviews of the file had not produced anything new, but they had kept the details sharp in his mind in a way he believed mattered, even if he could not have explained exactly why. He had retired from the department in 1989, but had made an arrangement with the new sheriff to retain access to the merchant case file in an unofficial capacity. The sheriff, a man named Dale Pressman, who had known Diane's father, had agreed without hesitation. The Hessler farm had changed hands in 1988. Harold Hessler had died. Dale Hessler had sold the land to a soybean operation out of Lansing. The irrigation ditch had been regraded. The two-track along the north edge of the field had been widened into a proper access road. By 1997, Diane's parents were gone. Connie was the only member of the immediate family still living in the county. She had raised her children, watched her niece and nephews grow up. Children who had barely known Diane, but had grown up hearing her name spoken in a particular careful way. The way families speak the names of the ones they are still grieving. The reward poster that had hung in the lobby of the Farm Bureau for 15 years had come down at some point in the mid-1990s. But Warren Eckley, who had retired in 1993, had kept a copy of it folded in his desk drawer at home until the day he died. Every case on this channel represents weeks of digging through records, verifying facts, and piecing together real lives that were lost. If you want us to keep uncovering the truth behind stories like this one, please take a second to like this video and subscribe. Drop a comment below letting us know where in the world you're watching from. Your support is what makes this possible. Now, let's get back to Diane. In 2017, the Michigan State Police Cold Case Unit received a request to review the Merchant homicide. The request came from a retired Van Buren County prosecutor named Helen Satterley, who had worked on the case peripherally in the mid-1980s and who had never fully let go of it. Satterley was 71 years old. She had been retired for 6 years. She had submitted the request as a private citizen, citing the case number and attaching a 4-page summary of the original investigation she had written from memory, and then verified against records she had obtained through a public documents request. The case was assigned to a Michigan State Police cold case detective named investigator Carla Johnson. Johnson was 44 years old, methodical, and had a particular interest in evidence that had been collected before modern forensic protocols and never fully re-examined. She requested the original physical evidence from Van Buren County storage. What came back was a cardboard evidence box from 1979. Inside were the fiber samples from Diane Merchant's clothing, the boot print cast, documentation of the tire track, and a sealed paper envelope containing 2 items collected at the scene that had been logged, but never successfully analyzed with the technology available in 1979. One was a small amount of biological material, organic, source undetermined at the time, collected from vegetation approximately 8 feet from where Diane's body had been found. The second was a partial hair sample found on Diane's coat. In 2019, Johnson submitted both samples to the MISP Forensic Lab for full DNA analysis using current methods. In the spring of 2020, the lab returned a partial DNA profile from the biological material. It was not a complete profile, but it was enough. Johnson submitted it to the National CODIS database in June 2020. No match came back. She did not stop. In late 2020, following the expanding use of investigative genetic genealogy, the same process that had identified killers in dozens of cold cases across the country by that point, Johnson submitted the profile to a forensic genealogy service. The process, as Johnson would explain it to the Van Buren County prosecutor in a later briefing, works by finding distant relatives of the unknown contributor in public ancestry databases and tracing those family trees forward to identify who in the current generation could be a biological match. It requires patience. It requires precision. It requires someone willing to treat a 40-year-old case as though it happened last week. Johnson and the genealogist assigned to assist her, a specialist named Timothy Rourke, who had worked on 11 cold cases with the Mesby, worked the tree for 7 months. In August 2021, a name came back. Raymond Calvin Stout. Johnson looked him up. She sat very still for a moment. Then she pulled the original 1979 interview logs. Raymond Calvin Stout was 73 years old. He had grown up in Harrow Falls. He had worked, from 1971 through 1983, as a field hand and equipment operator for various farms in Van Buren County, including for 2 seasons in 1977 and 1978, the Hessler operation. He had known the land. He had known the irrigation ditch. He had known the 2-track along the north edge of the field. He had also, according to the 1979 interview log, been spoken to by Detective Leonard Marsh in October of that year. He had been one of approximately 40 men interviewed broadly in the weeks following the discovery of Diane's body. He had been noted as cooperative, having no known connection to the victim, and having provided an account of his whereabouts on the morning of October 4th that Marsh had not been able to confirm, but also had not been able to disprove. The note in the file was 3 sentences long. Raymond Stout had been asked and had answered, and the investigation had moved on. He had not lived in Van Buren County since 1985. He had moved to a town called Benzonia, in Benzie County in the northwest of the Lower Peninsula, where he had lived for the past 36 years. He had worked for a landscaping company. He attended services at a Baptist church. He had a daughter in Traverse City and 2 grandchildren. He was, to every person in Benzonia who knew him at all, a quiet, polite, unremarkable man who had lived among them for nearly 4 decades without drawing a moment's concern. Investigator Johnson obtained a court order for a DNA sample. The sample was collected through a discarded plastic cup from the gas station, where Stout stopped on his way to his Tuesday morning church men's breakfast. It was submitted to the lab in September 2021. The match came back in November 2021. Full profile. The biological material collected from the vegetation 8 feet from Diane Merchant's body in a fallow field on Sutter Creek Road on October 7, 1979, matched Raymond Calvin Stout. On January 19, 2022, 2 Michigan State Police investigators drove to Benzonia. They found Raymond Stout in his garage, sorting through a box of garden tools for the coming season. He was arrested at 10:08 in the morning on a charge of first-degree murder. He did not resist. He looked at the investigators for a long moment and then looked away and said nothing. The news reached Harrow Falls before the day was over. The Van Buren County community that Raymond Stout had left behind nearly 40 years earlier was confronted, suddenly, with the face of a man most people under 50 had never heard of. But the older residents, the ones who had known the Merchant family, who had walked those search grids in October of 1979, who had sat in Loretta's diner and talked about what had happened to Diane, those people recognized the name. Some of them remembered him. A quiet young man, a farmhand. Nothing about him you'd remember if you tried. That was the thing. That was always the thing. Connie Merchant, who was 71 years old when the arrest was made, was at her kitchen table in the house she had lived in for 30 years when her phone rang. She listened to what the investigator told her. She asked one question. Did they have him? The investigator said yes. Connie set the phone down on the table and sat in silence for a while. Later she would say that she had expected, after 42 years, to feel something enormous. Instead, she said, it felt like something that had been held at a very great tension had simply, quietly, let go. Not loud, not dramatic, just done. Leonard Marsh was 83 years old. He had been in a memory care facility in Kalamazoo for 2 years when his daughter called to tell him. She was not certain, afterward, whether the information had fully reached him the way she'd hoped. But she told him. She sat beside him and told him that the merchant case had been solved, that there had been an arrest, that his work had mattered. He looked at her when she said it. He held her hand. Raymond Calvin Stout was tried in Van Buren County Circuit Court in October 2023. The prosecution presented the DNA evidence, the genealogical analysis, Stout's documented prior work on the Hessler property, and testimony from the forensic experts who had processed the 1979 samples and the 2021 comparison. The defense challenged the chain of custody for the original samples and argued that the genealogy methodology was insufficiently proven. The jury deliberated for 6 hours over 2 days. They returned a guilty verdict on the afternoon of October 17, 2023. 44 years, 13 days after Diane Lorene Merchant made coffee in a chipped blue mug and set it on her kitchen counter and did not finish it. Raymond Stout was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He made no statement at sentencing. He sat with his hands folded and his eyes down, and when the judge finished speaking, he was led out of the courtroom without turning to look at anyone. Connie Merchant spoke at the sentencing. She had written her statement by hand on 2 sheets of notepaper, and she read it without looking up. She spoke about her sister's tomato garden. She spoke about Grover the beagle, who had lived to be 14 and who had spent his whole life waiting by a back door that Diane never came back to open. She spoke about what it means to carry something for 44 years, and about the particular kind of courage required to keep believing that the answer exists even when every year that passes makes that belief harder to hold. She looked up once, at the end. Not at Stout, at investigator Carla Johnson, who was sitting in the gallery. She said, "Thank you for treating my sister like she mattered." Diane Lorene Merchant was 34 years old. She canned her tomatoes every August. She kept a beagle named Grover who slept at the foot of her bed. She knew every farm family in Van Buren County by name. She had a chipped blue mug she used every morning. She had a vegetable garden and a filing system no one else fully understood, and a sister who loved her with a constancy that lasted 44 years without resolution and did not break. She was found 3 miles from her own home, on land she would have recognized, in a county where everyone knew everyone, placed there by someone who had counted on the assumption that no one would ever look hard enough or long enough to find the answer. That assumption held for 4 decades. It did not hold forever. What broke it was not a dramatic discovery. It was a retired prosecutor who wrote a 4-page letter. A cold case investigator who treated a box from 1979 as if it had arrived yesterday. A genealogist who worked a family tree for 7 months. And a sealed paper envelope in a storage facility that had been sitting, patient and untouched, since the year the Voyager spacecraft passed Jupiter. The questions I keep sitting with are these. How many rural cold cases from the 1970s still have physical evidence in county storage that has never been reprocessed with modern methods, because no one has thought to ask, or because the budget wasn't there, or because the case seemed too old? What does it mean that the technology to solve Diane Merchant's murder existed for years before anyone applied it to her case? And what does it say about justice that one retired woman, submitting a request as a private citizen at age 71, is what finally moved the machine? I'd like to hear what you think. Does 44 years feel like justice, or like something else? And what part of this case stayed with you? Justice found Diane Lorene Merchant after 44 years. Stories like hers are why this channel exists. If you believe the truth is worth pursuing no matter how long it takes, subscribe so you don't miss the next case. More solved cold cases are waiting in the description below. Thank you for being here.